Ladies and gentlemen, let go of the picture of shining bronze armor and scarlet mantles billowing beneath a glorious Sunday. The true Sparta wasn't constructed in marble colosseums or upon battlefields of honor. It was constructed in chambers emptied of tenderness and in cradles governed by terror. For the Spartans, the deed that in other places signified love or desire was merely a civic obligation. The human form was not personal property, it was a tool of the state. Longing was recast as duty. What others named affection, Sparta named compliance. From the instant a child was formed, it belonged not to those who made it, but to the apparatus of the city that had perfected the science of dominance. Every partnership started with an order. Marriage was not a matter of emotion, but of calculations, stature, power, ancestry, reproduction. Officials old enough to have lost memory of gentleness inspected young men and women as though they were cattle. They studied shoulders, hips, skeletal frames, and respiration, searching for pairings that might produce the coming generation of fighters. Love was not outlawed, it was simply meaningless. A household that created feeble children was a violation against the city. So Sparta removed that decision. The state became the arranger of fate. The powerful were matched with the powerful, not for enjoyment, but for function. The others could observe, labor, and submit. The women of Sparta were not confined in stillness as they were in other Greek territories. They drilled in the exposed fields, their muscles toughened by running, grappling, and hurling the spear. But their power was not for their own sake. It was conditioning for bearing children. They were informed that their bodies were state assets, their wombs manufacturing centers for coming soldiers. The state persuaded them that the honor of motherhood rested not in gentleness but in output. A woman's value was calculated in the vitality of her sons, not in the depth of her affection. They discovered early that tenderness was a privilege too delicate for a world constructed on order. If a warrior's spouse could not produce children, or if her children were feeble, the answer was not sympathy but replacement. The state permitted, and sometimes commanded, another woman, demonstrated strong and fertile, to bear his child. The arrangement brought no disgrace, no concealment. It was not infidelity because love held no authority here. It was civic obligation. Husbands received it as distinction. Wives tolerated it as regulation. The outcome was a society that converted biology into administration. A nation where the most private deed was simply another exchange documented in the record of power. When childbirth finally arrived, it did not deliver happiness. The mother's tears were not of celebration, but of terror. The newborn was removed from her embrace and transported to a gathering of elders, men who had long abandoned the gentleness of compassion. They examined the infant as though it were an item crafted in a forge, rotating it, measuring it, assessing it for balance. Every muscle, every sound, every motion was an evaluation. A flawless child was pronounced suitable for Sparta. A flawed one was removed. There were no discussions, no challenges, only the harsh reasoning of existence. The doomed infants were transported to the base of Mount Tatus, to a location called the Deposits, where they were abandoned to the elements and the predators. The elders claimed it was not murder, simply releasing flawed material to the wilderness. For them, compassion was a term that compromised the fortifications. Only power deserved existence because only power could protect the city. The mothers did not cry out. They had been instructed that mourning was betrayal. Their anguish was voiceless, interred under the same soil that received their children. The reasoning behind this brutality was as ancient as terror. Sparta was a small city encircled by adversaries and constructed upon the toil of the helots, servants who exceeded the citizens many times in number. A single generation of frailty could signify annihilation. In such a reality, compassion was betrayal. They had no thinkers to question the worth of existence, only fighters to preserve it. Existence had substituted morality. The people became their own instrument, and every child was shaped in that manner. At the age of 7, and following OPTIC, phase NERVE commenced. The boy was removed from his dwelling, from the embrace of the mother, who had risked all to deliver him, and transferred to the state. She did not weep. She repeated to him his obligation. "Come back with your shield or on it." It was not symbolic language. It was the sole principle of being. From that instant forward, the boy's family stopped having significance. His new dwelling was the military quarters. His new brothers were his squadron, and his new father was the state in its entirety. The initial teaching was scarcity. The boys rested on beds of rushes. They had to gather themselves from the riverside. They wore a single garment through cold months and warm months. Their portions were modest by intention. Starvation, they were informed, refineses the body and the intellect. If they desired additional food, they were required to take it. If they were captured, the penalty was severe, but not for the taking, only for being caught. The principle was clear. Failure was the only transgression. Success validated everything. They discovered early that cleverness was an asset and frailty a felony. In this reality, quietness was strength. Words were limited like nourishment. A boy who voiced thoughts carelessly was disciplined instantly. Questions were snares. Instructors demanded responses that were brief, sharp, and bold. A delayed reply invited suffering. Uncertainty was dishonor. From this emerged the term laconic, derived from the territory of Laconia, where every statement was sharpened to a blade. The boys discovered that thinking should be rapid. Feeling concealed, they discovered to endure without noise and to grin beneath the lash. Suffering was no longer an adversary, but an instrument. The senior cadets dominated over the junior with the harshness of the conditioned. It was not individual, it was procedure. Each deed of degradation was a teaching in submission. At eating times, the senior boys launched questions like projectiles. Who was the most courageous man in Sparta? What was the supreme virtue? Could taking be honorable? The responses mattered less than the steadiness of the one speaking. The slightest stammer could trigger a strike. Terror was the unseen teacher in every section of the military quarters. Trust nobody, display no frailty. The teaching was constant and powerful. Once each year, their resilience was examined before the gods in the city. At the shrine of Artemis Arthur, the boys had to grab cheese positioned upon the holy stone, while priests and senior youth struck them with lashes. To cry out was humiliation. To fall in quietness was victory. Observers reported that some boys perished under the whip without uttering a noise, grinning through blood as though suffering were a decoration. The audience did not grieve for them, they cheered. Sparta had no monuments for writers or creators, but it retained the identities of those who bled without a sound. When a boy matured into a man, he accessed the concluding stage, the hidden one. The city's dread had created a ceremony of shadows called the crier. Each year, the leaders of Sparta proclaimed a symbolic conflict against the Helots, the workers who cultivated their territory. With that proclamation, killing became permitted. The most talented young men were dispatched into the farmland with nothing but a blade and instructions to eliminate those Helots considered too powerful, too intelligent, or too defiant. They were to conceal themselves by daylight and stalk by darkness. It was not about elimination. It was about terror. It was about converting dread into procedure. For the young assassins, it was also an evaluation. Could they terminate a life not in fury, but in obligation? Could they eliminate for the concept of Sparta without hesitation or remorse? Those who came back were not honored. They were merely acknowledged as though they had crossed an invisible threshold, dividing the human from the perfect Spartan. The city no longer had to direct them. They had transformed into the directive in itself. At 30, the soldier was permitted to reside with a wife, though even this was a false sense of liberty. The wedding, was a ceremony emptied of sentiment. The woman's head was shaved. She was clothed in men's garments and left waiting in a dark chamber. The husband would slip away from his military quarters, visit her momentarily, and come back before sunrise. The concealment was intentional. The state feared connection more than infidelity. A man who cherished his wife might waver in combat. A man who craved her might forsake order, so closeness was limited like all else. The women did not object. They had been trained to accept that their wombs were as holy as the city's fortifications. They understood that their function was to restore the numbers that conflict and conditioning constantly consumed. They were satisfied with their resilience, satisfied even with their suffering. When their sons were removed at 7, they did not hold on to them. They stood firm, instructing them to come back victorious or not at all. In that instant, the state's labor was finished. It had substituted the most ancient human impulse, the connection between mother and child, with something harsher and more practical, loyalty to the whole. For generations it functioned. Sparta's soldiers became the dread of the ancient realm. They battled without terror, perished without wavering, and followed without inquiry. But underneath the iron order and the successes on the combat field, a gradual decay had started. Every generation created fewer citizens. Every triumph required more than it could sustain. And the identical system that had constructed the most powerful men in Greece was silently devouring the nation that formed them. What Sparta, shaped in its quest for flawlessness, would in time become the burden that pulled it into oblivion. By the time Sparta arrived at the peak of its magnificence, the fractures beneath its iron exterior had already started to expand. What had formerly been a community of absolute intention was transforming into a structure contaminated by its own flawlessness. The apparatus that had produced the most powerful soldiers in history had also produced the circumstances for its own disappearance. The identical order that constructed the city now started to smother it. The regulations that shaped heroes could not pardon frailty, and the realm beyond the peaks was shifting more rapidly than the Spartans could comprehend. Their power had been total, their principles unshakable, but flawlessness is a delicate matter. A single floor once hidden can multiply like decay underneath marble. For Sparta, that floor was concealed in its fixation with purity. The exact structure that yielded the most fearsome soldiers also guaranteed that their population would never be sufficient. Every newborn was a risk. Every infant who endured inspection a coming warrior. Yet every conflict, every clash, every ceremony thinned their population. The equilibrium between birth and death had been too exact for too extended. And as one generation poured out on the combat field, another struggled to restore it. The population catastrophe started quietly, almost unnoticeably. The identical eugenic regulations that had made Sparta dominant started to turn against it. Too many infants were abandoned on the mountain. Too many mothers had perished in delivery. Too many fathers had fallen on distant ground. The city that formerly commanded terror now confronted a simpler, more lethal adversary: numbers. For every generation of 300 who battled, few were returned to create children. Every soldier was a testament to what came before, but an emptiness in what followed. The citizens, formerly satisfied to name themselves equals, diminished to a few thousand, then a few hundred. Even as the identity of Sparta resounded through the realm, its pulse was weakening. The commanders of the city grasped what was occurring. But their solution was identical as before. More order, more authority. They reinforced the regulations instead of relaxing them. The structure that had grown too limited attempted to rescue itself by growing even more limited. Outsiders were prohibited from joining into Spartan lineages. Adoption was curtailed. The definition of who could name himself a genuine Spartan contracted until it transformed into a death verdict. By protecting their purity, they guaranteed their disappearance. While Sparta struggled to maintain its population, the remainder of Greece was evolving. Athens, formerly ridiculed for its discussion and thinking, had transformed into a workshop of concepts. Corinth exchanged with remote territories, Thebes tested with new structures of authority. The realm was discovering to adjust, to create, to challenge. Sparta, in opposition, remained motionless. The identical order that had formerly been its power transformed into inflexibility. Innovation was betrayal. Change was frailty. A Spartan soldier could maintain a position, but he could not conceive a new one. The Agoge yielded soldiers who were unbreakable in combat, but powerless in tranquility. Their complete lives had been committed to battle. When there was no conflict, they simply faded. They had no craft, no thinking, no wealth beyond domination. Even their tongue, formerly precise as a spear, started to deteriorate. Their intellects had been conditioned for submission, not formation. The realm beyond their barriers grew more refined, while they remained confined in the plainness of power. They had constructed the flawless hammer, but history had already transformed into a realm of locks and keys. Then arrived victory, the most merciless gift of all. After generations of conflict, Sparta conquered Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Greece rested at its feet. The vision of dominance, generations in the creation, had ultimately been accomplished. But triumph required a new form of ability, one Sparta did not hold. It could dominate, but it could not rule. The riches of conquered adversaries poured into its pathways, and with it arrived decay. The iron order that had characterized the city started to dissolve in the warmth of luxury. The regulations of Liris, the creator, who had formerly prohibited the employment of gold and silver to maintain equality, were silently disregarded. Riches started to gather in a few palms. Territory formerly separated equally among citizens, transformed into holdings for the dominant. The citizens who had formerly divided a single garment in winter now feasted on imported beverages and distant delights. Desire entered into their dwellings like vapor, invisible at first, then suffocating. The new generation of Spartans matured in a realm their forebears would not have acknowledged. They still advanced in arrangement and voiced in brief, precise words, but the intensity behind their order had diminished. Some started to employ hired fighters to battle their conflicts. Others purchased their path into the positions instead of securing their location through suffering. The Agoge, formerly a furnace that incinerated away frailty, transformed into an hollow ritual. The city that had characterized itself by offering now surrendered to ease, but decay alone did not eliminate Sparta. It merely weakened it for the concluding strike. The genuine death arrived from the exterior in the shape of a man who grasped what the Spartans had abandoned. That conflict is not only about power, but about creativity. In 371 B.C., near the modest Bayan settlement of Latra, a Thene commander named Armandes transformed the principles of combat. The Spartans had always battled in flawless balance, their formations as direct and firm as the barriers of their city. They accepted that arrangement was unconquerable. Amyandondas chose to shatter that arrangement. He assembled his finest troops on one edge of the terrain, 50 men profound, and directed them straight at the Spartan right side where the king himself positioned. The strike was abrupt, unconventional, catastrophic. The Spartans had no protection against unpredictability. Their flawless arrangement crumbled under the force of innovation. When the debris settled, the king was deceased, and with him the legend of Spartan invulnerability. The conquest at Ra was not merely a military defeat. It was an existential breakdown. For generations, Sparta had informed itself that its structure was unbreakable. Now the fantasy was vanished. The realm had surpassed the principles of the Agoge. The soldiers who had been trained to accept they were divine among men found that they could perish like anyone else. The iron order that had formerly made them courageous now rendered them fragile. They could not adjust, could not transform, could not perceive beyond the ancient directives etched into their essence. After Leucra, Sparta never restored. Its population persisted to descend. Its territory was separated and traded. Its citizens transformed into phantoms of a disappeared arrangement. The offspring of soldiers who formerly challenged empires found themselves diminished to a spectacle. Roman visitors generations later would arrive to observe the remains of their ceremonies, the lashings at the shrine, the voiceless movements, the exercises executed for observers, and wonder at phantoms of order. Sparta had transformed into a display of its own legend. But history is harsh, and it retains irony's finest. The city that eliminated sympathy in quest of power perished because it abandoned that sympathy is also a shape of power. By removing love, it removed persistence. By venerating the state, it depleted the essence that could have maintained it living. The identical structure that instructed mothers to dispatch their sons to death without tears guaranteed that one day there would be no sons remaining to dispatch. The fixation with flawlessness was not safeguarding, it was contamination. The concluding generations of Spartans existed among wreckage, grasping to ceremonies that had lost their significance. They still informed their children accounts of Thermopylae of the 300, who positioned against the Persian surge. But even those children could detect that the magnificent belonged to another realm. Their forebears had perished for a concept too absolute to endure contact with existence. They had constructed a civilization on authority, but authority cannot surpass the disorder of time. In the conclusion, Sparta's collapse was not a single occurrence, but a gradual dissolution. The structure that had converted human beings into instruments had no method to produce citizens who could construct, conceive, or pardon. Its people had abandoned how to be human. They had been trained to tolerate every suffering except the suffering of contemplation. And when their barriers ultimately collapsed, there was no one remaining inside to restore them. What persists of Sparta today is not stone or empire, but a caution. Power without sympathy, order without intention, power without love. These are testaments that break down under their own mass. The Spartans accepted they had found immortality through authority, but history retains them for their disappearance. The flawlessness they pursued was never human. It was automated, and like every apparatus, it ultimately devoured its creators. Perhaps that is why their account still captivates us. It is not only about conflict or magnificence. It is about what occurs when a civilization determines that the human heart is disposable. When a community offers tenderness for power, it succeeds every clash but surrenders its essence. Sparta produced the flawless warrior, but in executing so it eliminated the exact thing that makes warriors worth battling for. Thank you for watching the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Did you like my story or not? Please tell me in the comments.